Kenneth Neild, step away from the table.
Back up here.
The 200.
Kenneth Neild kept his own records of every account he drained, every policy he forged, and every lie he filed on behalf of a dead man.
The $257,000 you pulled out of Keith Jerome's accounts using his power of attorney for the past 5 years.
Wait, you said that, what? Who are you again? What
The
agency
forged
are you
debt
with?
document, the insurance fraud, the car you transferred into your...
Those records are now Exhibit A, and they read like a confession he wrote himself. 2 insurance companies, 2 stories, same client. At the exact same moment, Kenneth Neild was telling one carrier that Keith Jerome was dead, submitting a claim for a funeral he had never performed, and telling a different carrier that the same 84-year-old man was still alive, so policies on that side could keep paying out. Both files survived. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office would eventually pull them onto the same desk. $257,916.61. Stolen from a dying man who had asked only that what remained of his life savings be given to school children in Honduras, school children in East Africa, and the seniors at a community center in Coatesville. Not a single dollar of it would arrive. Before we go any further, have you ever signed a power of attorney for a parent, a grandparent, a dying friend, without reading every page? Drop a comment and tell me what document. And if you're not subscribed, hit the button now. We cover the cases that prove why those signatures matter every single week. Kenneth Neild grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, in the corridor of small boroughs and stone churches, where the funeral director's name on a Victorian sign had often been the same name for 3 generations. He was born in 1974 in Westchester, the only son of a father who sold commercial insurance out of a 1-room office above a hardware store, and a mother who kept the books for a mainline dentist. His parents were not wealthy, and they were not poor. They were the kind of people who paid their bills on the day the bills arrived, who kept a small whole-life policy on each member of the household, and who believed, with a calm and unshowy certainty, that the worst thing a person could do in this world was die owing money to a neighbor. The Neild home had a finished basement with a long workbench, a wall of pegboard tools, and an old metal filing cabinet his father kept locked. Inside that cabinet were the policies, the family's own, the parents' parents, and what would, decades later, strike Kenneth as a kind of training manual. File folders for every relative who had ever been buried in Chester County, each one containing the funeral home contract, the death certificate, the burial permit, and a small handwritten note from his father indicating what the family had paid and what the insurance had covered. As a boy, he was allowed to look at the folders, but not to touch them. He understood, before he was 10 years old, that paper was the thing that survived a person. He graduated from Westchester East High School in 1992, an average student remembered by classmates for an unusual composure, for the fact that he was the one teachers asked to walk a crying friend to the nurse's office, the one who knew where the tissues were at the wake when a classmate's father died of a heart attack the summer before junior year. He worked his last 2 summers of high school cutting grass and trimming hedges at Old St. Joseph Cemetery in Westchester. And at the end of the second summer, the cemetery superintendent asked him, with no condescension and no joke in his voice, whether he had ever thought about the trade. He had. He enrolled at the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science in the fall of 1993, 600 miles from home and his first time on a campus. The institute was a small, serious school. Clinical embalming lab in the basement, a teaching prep room with stainless steel tables and overhead exhaust, lectures on restorative art and grief counseling and Pennsylvania funeral law. Kenneth's instructors described him in his evaluations as quiet, deliberate, and unusually steady in the prep room. One added a sentence that, in another decade, would read very differently, that Mr. Neal demonstrated an exceptional comfort with the business side of the profession: record-keeping, billing, insurance reconciliation. That should serve him well in private practice. He completed his associate's degree, returned to Chester County, and apprenticed for 3 years at Boylan and Brothers Funeral Home in Paoli, a fourth-generation operation that handled 300 services a year. He was licensed by the Pennsylvania State Board of Funeral Directors in 1997. He married Megan Crowther, a parochial school teacher he had met at a parish dinner in the spring of 1998, in the same Catholic church where they would later baptize their daughter. They bought a brick split level in East Goshen Township. He kept his hours. He paid his bills on the day they arrived. He sent a sympathy card to every family Boylan and Brothers buried for the entire 8 years he worked there, signed in his own slanted, careful hand. In 2005, with a small loan from his father-in-law and a larger one from a community bank in Paoli, he bought a vacant 2-story brick building on King Street in Malvern, redid the interior with cream walls and dark trim, and 2 viewing rooms named for local Revolutionary War battlefields, and opened Neal Family Funeral Care. The grand opening photo, which ran in the daily local news, showed Kenneth in a charcoal suit shaking the mayor's hand in front of a glass-fronted curio cabinet displaying urns. He was 31 years old. The funeral home did well. Malvern was an older borough with an aging population and an unusual density of small Protestant and Catholic congregations, whose pastors learned within a year that Kenneth Neal returned phone calls within the hour, that he did not upsell, and that he treated the bodies of the indigent with the same care as the bodies of the wealthy. By 2009, he was burying or cremating more than 200 Chester County residents a year. He hired 2 part-time apprentices. He bought a new hearse, a black Cadillac XTS, and traded the family minivan for an Audi station wagon. He paid his bills on the day they arrived. What changed, what would, in hindsight, change everything, was the second license, and then the third. In 2011, Kenneth sat for and passed the Pennsylvania Life and Health Insurance examination and was issued a producer's license, allowing him to sell life insurance, annuities, and pre-need funeral insurance directly to clients. In 2012, he completed the coursework required to be certified as a long-term care specialist, a designation marketed to families navigating the financial side of aging, Medicaid spend-down planning, irrevocable funeral trusts, the conversion of life policies into long-term care benefits. He printed new business cards. The new cards listed, beneath his name, 3 lines: licensed funeral director, licensed insurance producer, certified long-term care specialist. He had become, in his own quiet phrasing, the only call a family ever needed to make. To understand what Kenneth Neal did, you have to understand what a small-town funeral director with 3 licenses can actually touch. The position is one of the most concentrated trust roles that exists outside of a hospital or a courtroom, and almost none of it is supervised in real time. A licensed funeral director in Pennsylvania is permitted to take possession of a deceased person's body within hours of death, to file the death certificate with the state's electronic registry, to obtain burial transit permits, to handle the deceased's clothing and personal effects, and, most importantly for what was about to happen in Malvern, to act as an authorized agent on the deceased's pre-need funeral insurance policies. The same director if also licensed as an insurance producer, can sell those pre-need policies to the same client during the client's lifetime, write the policy himself, hold the policy himself, and then, after the client dies, collect against the policy himself. The state requires a chain of paperwork to exist. The state does not require that chain to be checked by any disinterested third party until something goes audibly wrong. A long-term care specialist designation adds another layer. The certification, offered through several private trade institutes, signals to families that the holder understands Medicaid eligibility rules, the 5-year look-back, the difference between a revocable and irrevocable funeral trust, and the labyrinthine accounting that determines whether a dying parent's assets will be eaten by a nursing home or preserved for heirs. Specialists in this space are routinely invited into the most private financial conversations a family will ever have. They sit at kitchen tables. They look at brokerage statements. They are told, often within the first meeting, the names of every bank, every advisor, every account number a dying person owns. And then, sometimes, they are asked to hold the power of attorney. A general durable power of attorney under Pennsylvania law is, for practical purposes, a master key. The signed and notarized form authorizes the named agent to access bank accounts, transfer titles to vehicles, sell real estate, file tax returns, change insurance beneficiaries, take loans, write checks. The principal, the dying person whose name appears at the top, does not need to be consulted on any individual transaction once the document is signed. The agent's signature is treated by banks and insurance companies and the IRS as the principal's own. Pennsylvania's statute requires the agent to act in accordance with the principal's reasonable expectations and in good faith. It does not require the agent to file periodic reports. It does not require any second signature on any transaction. It does not require an annual audit. It does not require notification to any heir, charity, or beneficiary that the document exists. The only meaningful safeguard built into the statute is the assumption that the named agent is a person of conscience. When a single operator holds the funeral director's license, the insurance producer's license, the long-term care specialist certification, and the dying client's durable power of attorney, the operator becomes, in functional terms, the only person on earth who knows the full picture of that client's last financial year. The family does not know. The accountant does not know. The charities the client has named as beneficiaries certainly do not know. The state, until a tax return is filed or a claim is submitted, does not know. Kenneth Neild held all 4 positions at once for Keith Jerome. There was nothing illegal about holding all 4. The illegality lay entirely in what he did with them. Keith Jerome was 84 years old. He lived in a small frame house in Bucks County, on a side street with mature maples and a low picket fence. His wife had died in 2012. They had not had children. He had worked, for most of his adult life, as a draftsman for a precision instruments firm outside Doylestown, and he had retired in the late 1990s with a modest pension, a paid-off house, 2 whole-life policies, and a brokerage account he had funded steadily over 35 years. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2016. By June, his oncologist had told him plainly that he should be making arrangements. By July, he had done what the responsible people of his generation were taught to do. He had begun looking for someone to help him put his affairs in order. He found Kenneth Neild through a parish referral. A neighbor of Keith's had buried her husband at Neild Family Funeral Care 2 years earlier and had described Kenneth, on the porch one afternoon, as a young man who treats everything like it matters. Keith called the King Street office. Kenneth drove out to Bucks County himself the following Tuesday. That was already part of the brand, that the director came to the home and sat at Keith's kitchen table for nearly 3 hours, asking the questions a long-term care specialist is trained to ask. What were the policies? Who were the beneficiaries? Did Keith have an existing will? Was there a current durable power of attorney? Who, if no one, was Keith expecting to coordinate the practical work of his death, the funeral arrangements, the final tax return, the distribution of what remained? Keith Jerome had clear answers. He wanted a simple Catholic funeral. He wanted to be cremated and interred next to his wife. And he wanted what was left of his estate, after the funeral expenses, after the final tax bill, after the small, specific bequests to 2 cousins in New Jersey, to go in 3 roughly equal portions to 3 organizations. The first was Amigos de Jesus, a children's home and educational program for impoverished and orphaned children in Honduras. The second was Zawadi Fund International, which provides secondary school scholarships to girls in East Africa. The third was the Coatesville Senior Center, a small community organization in Chester County that ran a daily lunch program and a weekly transportation service for residents who could no longer drive. Kenneth wrote each of the 3 names in his leather-bound appointment notebook in his slanted, careful hand. He told Keith that he would draft a power of attorney that named him as agent, that he would coordinate with Keith's existing attorney to update the will, and that, if Keith wished, Kenneth could handle the entire estate distribution himself, sparing the 2 New Jersey cousins the burden of paperwork. Keith Jerome signed the power of attorney form on a Wednesday afternoon in late July of 2016. It was notarized by a notary Kenneth had brought with him from Malvern. Keith died on a Sunday morning in early September, at home, in hospice care, less than 6 weeks after the document had been signed. What Kenneth Neal did between the signing and the death, and in the months that followed, would be laid out 4.5 years later in the Pennsylvania Attorney General's filings. He began drawing against Jerome's accounts almost immediately. Bank records, later subpoenaed, would show transfers from Jerome's primary checking account at a Doylestown bank into Kenneth's personal checking account in Malvern within 9 days of the power of attorney being executed. The transfers were not labeled as fees. They were not labeled as reimbursements. They were not labeled at all. He used the money to pay his own quarterly federal estimated taxes. He used it to pay the electric bill at the King Street Funeral Home. He used it to pay the homeowner's insurance premium on his East Goshen split level. He used it to pay down a balance on a personal credit card. He used it, and this is the line that would, more than any other, make jurors lean forward 4 years later, to pay for a vacation home rental at a beach town in southern Delaware that he had booked for the 2nd week of August, 3 weeks after Keith Jerome had signed the power of attorney and 3 weeks before Keith Jerome would die. He transferred the title of Jerome's car, a 6-year-old Buick LeSabre with low mileage, into his own name. He filed the transfer with PennDOT. He used the car to drive between funeral homes for the next 18 months. After Jerome died, Kenneth handled the funeral himself. The viewing was held at Neild Family Funeral Care on a Wednesday afternoon. 6 people attended. Kenneth gave a short address. The cremation was performed at a partner facility in Delaware County. The urn was interred next to Mrs. Jerome's plot in Doylestown the following Saturday. Total documented cost of the service, less than $4,000. 3 weeks later, Kenneth filed a pre-need insurance claim against one of Keith Jerome's 2 whole-life policies, billing the carrier for a funeral he had structured the paperwork to suggest had cost substantially more, and, in a second, filing against the same carrier for an additional service that had never been performed at all. The carrier paid. The money went into the funeral home's operating account and, from there, into Kenneth's. At the same time, the second whole-life policy, held by a different carrier, continued to draw against a small premium account Keith had pre-funded on the assumption that Keith was still alive. Kenneth never reported the death to that company. He maintained the fiction in correspondence. He answered a routine wellness inquiry letter from the carrier on Jerome's behalf, signing Jerome's name. He let the second policy keep paying out, against itself, in a slow trickle that fed back into the same accounts he had been draining since July. And then, perhaps most brazenly, he manufactured a document, a typed and signed agreement, backdated, suggesting that Keith Jerome had owed Kenneth Neild a substantial sum for long-term care planning services rendered, and that the transfers from Jerome's account to Kenneth's during the final weeks of Jerome's life had been Jerome's repayment of that debt. The document was filed nowhere official. It existed only in Kenneth's own files, to be produced in the event that anyone, a charity, an executor, a tax examiner, ever asked. When the time came to file the Jerome estate's federal and Pennsylvania tax returns, Kenneth filed both. He signed as the agent of the estate. He misstated the assets. He omitted the transfers. He produced a return that, on its face, suggested there was almost nothing left in the estate after final expenses, and therefore that the 3 charities Keith Jerome had named would receive almost nothing because there was almost nothing to give. The 3 charities received notification letters on Neild Family Funeral Care letterhead, regretting that the estate had been smaller than the decedent had hoped and that there were no funds to distribute. The letters were polite, they were signed. They were, in their own quiet way, the final theft. For nearly 2 years, nothing happened. Keith Jerome was dead. His wife was dead. He had no children. His 2 New Jersey cousins had received their small specific bequests promptly. Kenneth had been careful to honor those, and had no reason to question the rest. The 3 charities had accepted their regret letters. The Doylestown attorney, who had once held a copy of Keith's will, had retired and closed his practice. The Pennsylvania Department of Revenue had accepted the estate tax return as filed. The funeral home in Malvern was busier than ever. Kenneth had bought a new hearse. What broke the case open was not an audit, not a whistleblower, not a forensic accountant. It was a phone call. In the late summer of 2018, the director of donor relations at Zawadi Fund International, a woman named Patricia Awar, who worked out of a small office in Boston and who, as part of her job, kept a running file of every estate bequest the charity had been notified of, pulled up Keith Jerome's name during a routine year-end follow-up. Keith had written to the charity in 2014, 2 years before his death, to advise them in plain language that they had been named in his estate plan and that they should expect to hear from his representative in due course. Patricia had filed the letter and forgotten it. Now, 2 years after Keith's date of death, and nearly 4 years after his letter, she called the number Keith had once given her to confirm receipt of the bequest. She reached Neild Family Funeral Care. A receptionist took a message. Kenneth, when he returned the call the following Monday, was warm and apologetic, and confirmed exactly what his regret letter had said, that the estate, after expenses, had been insufficient to fund the bequests, and that he was deeply sorry to have to deliver that news. Patricia Awar thanked him politely and hung up. Then she walked down the hall to her director's office, set the message slip on the desk, and said something close to this. "He is lying. I do not know how I know. I just know." Zawadi Fund International had a standing relationship with a small, non-profit sector law firm in Boston that did pro bono advisory work for international children's charities. Patricia forwarded Keith Jerome's 2014 letter and her note from the phone call. The firm filed a request under Pennsylvania's Right to Know law and the relevant provisions of the Probate, Estates, and Fiduciaries Code for the public record portions of the Jerome estate's filings. They received, within 6 weeks, the executor's accounting and the cover pages of the estate tax return. They read it twice. Then they called the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Charitable Trusts and Organizations section. We are heading into the investigation now. If you want to know exactly how the system handled this, subscribe. We break down every detail. The Charitable Trusts section forwarded the file to the Criminal Prosecution section of the Attorney General's office in early 2019. Senior Deputy Attorney General Christopher Riley was assigned. Riley had spent 11 years in the Financial Crimes Unit and had, in his own phrasing, buried a lot of people in their own paperwork. Within 90 days, his unit had drafted and served subpoenas on 4 entities: the Doylestown Bank that had held Keith Jerome's primary checking account, the brokerage firm that had held his investment account, and the 2 insurance carriers that had written his whole life policies. The 2 insurance files arrived in the same week. The first carrier's file contained Kenneth Neald's claim submission for the funeral expenses, dated October of 2016, supported by an itemized invoice on Neald Family Funeral Care letterhead, listing services that, when later cross-checked against the funeral home's own internal records and the partner crematorium's billing, included at least 2 line items for work that had not been performed. The carrier had paid in full. The second submission, 4 months later, billed the same policy for an additional service. There was no documentation in the funeral home's own files corresponding to that service. It had not happened. The second carrier's file told a different and stranger story. The policy was still active as of the date Riley's subpoena arrived. The carrier had received no notification of Keith Jerome's death. Correspondence in the file, signed in what appeared to be Keith Jerome's hand, but dated more than a year after his actual date of death, confirmed his continued residence in Bucks County and his continued good health. A signature analyst from the Attorney General's office compared the post-mortem signatures to Jerome's signature on bank records from before his diagnosis. The analyst's report ran 16 pages. The conclusion was unequivocal. The bank records, when laid out across a conference table in the Strawberry Square offices in Harrisburg, told the story by themselves. The transfers from Jerome's checking account to Kenneth Neald's checking account began 9 days after the power of attorney was signed and continued, in irregular amounts and at irregular intervals, for 16 months. Through Jerome's death, through the funeral, through the estate filing, into the next calendar year, every transfer reconciled to a personal expense on Kenneth's side: the vacation home rental in Delaware, the federal estimated taxes, the credit card balance, the homeowner's insurance premium, the electric bill at the funeral home. The forged debt document was found during a search of Kenneth's office, executed under warrant in February of 2021. It was in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, in a folder labeled with Jerome's last name. Riley's investigators photographed it on the desk before they bagged it. The estate tax return, when finally compared line by line against the actual bank records, contradicted itself in 19 separate places. Riley's forensic accountant would later testify that the return was not merely inaccurate. It had been, in her language, constructed to support a story that the underlying transactions did not. By the time the file was complete, it ran to more than 2,000 pages. The criminal complaint was approved by the Attorney General's office in late February of 2021. The charges were filed on the 11th of March. It was a Thursday morning in March, just after 9 o'clock, when two agents from the Bureau of Criminal Investigations of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office walked into the King Street lobby of Neild Family Funeral Care. Kenneth was in his back office. The lead agent, a man named Detective Anthony Mara, 22 years on the job, had called ahead at 8:30 to ask Kenneth to be available for a conversation about a former client. Kenneth had said yes. He had cleared his morning. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a navy tie. There was a cup of coffee, still warm, on his desk. Mara came in with his partner and one uniformed Chester County deputy. He set a folder on the desk and opened it. Mara, Mr. Neild, we are here about Keith Jerome. Kenneth nodded. His face did not change. Mara placed the first document on the desk. Mara, this is the power of attorney you executed with Mr. Jerome in July of 2016. Is this your signature? Neild. Yes. He placed the second document. Mara, this is the estate tax return you filed in his name. Neild. Yes. The third. Mara, this is a claim you submitted to the first carrier against his pre-need insurance policy. A pause. Neild. Yes. The fourth. Mara, this is a piece of correspondence sent to the second carrier, also in his name, dated 19 months after he was buried. Kenneth looked at the page. He did not pick it up. Mara, Mr. Neild. Neild. Yes. Mara, did Mr. Jerome write that letter? He was quiet for a long time. The coffee on his desk had gone cold. Outside the office door, in the lobby, a phone rang and was answered by his receptionist with the same warm professional cadence she used every morning. Kenneth listened to her voice through the door. Neild. I'd like to call my attorney. Mara. That is your right, sir. Neild. I'd like to call him now. Mara. That is your right. Mara and his partner waited in the lobby for the next 45 minutes while Kenneth's attorney drove down from Westchester. At 10:38, Kenneth was arrested in the parking lot of his own funeral home, behind a black Cadillac hearse that he himself had purchased 2 years earlier, with money that was supposed to be feeding children in Honduras. The charges filed by Senior Deputy Attorney General Christopher Riley on behalf of the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General under then Attorney General Josh Shapiro listed counts under 3 principal statutes: theft by unlawful taking, codified at 18 Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes, Section 3921, forgery at Section 4101, and insurance fraud at Section 4117. The complaint was supported by exhibits ranging from the seized debt document to the 2 insurance carriers' files to the 19 separate falsifications in the estate tax return. The case was assigned to the Court of Common Pleas of Chester County and to the Honorable Judge Wallace Bateman. The case proceeded through the spring and summer of 2021. The available public record does not indicate whether the disposition came by plea agreement or by verdict. What it shows plainly is that on every count, the disposition was the same: guilty. On Friday, the 10th of September, 2021, Kenneth Neild stood in a courtroom in Westchester to be sentenced. He was 47 years old, He was wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn on the morning of his arrest 6 months earlier. His wife was in the gallery. Their daughter, by then a sophomore at a small Catholic college in Philadelphia, was not. The Commonwealth's allocution was brief. Riley read into the record the names of the 3 charities: Amigos de Jesus, Zawadi Fund International, and the Coatesville Senior Center, and the approximate sums each would have received under the terms Keith Jerome had specified. He read the total restitution figure. He read the description of the forged debt document. He read, last, a single paragraph from Patricia Awar of Zawadi Fund International, who had written to the court at the prosecution's invitation. Awar's letter: "We do not need the money to do our work. We had the money before we ever met Mr. Jerome, and we will have it after." What was taken was not currency. It was a man's last instruction. He had thought about what should happen after he was gone, and he had told someone he trusted, and that person decided his last instruction did not matter. That is what this defendant took, not from us, from him. Judge Bateman read from the bench for several minutes before pronouncing sentence. He observed, without raising his voice, that the case before him represented as concentrated a betrayal of trust as he had seen in 23 years on the bench. He observed that Mr. Neild had held 4 positions of trust over the decedent simultaneously: funeral director, insurance producer, long-term care specialist, and durable agent, and that each of those positions, on its own, demanded an exceptional standard of conduct. He observed that Mr. Neild had instead used the convergence of those positions as an architecture for theft. He observed that the victim had been a dying man who had chosen, in his last clear-minded weeks, to direct the remainder of his life's work toward children he had never met, and toward neighbors who needed a hot lunch and a ride to the doctor. He observed that those children and those neighbors had received nothing. He sentenced Kenneth Neild to 2.5 to 5 years in a state correctional institution, with 7 years of probation to be served concurrent with the period of incarceration and supervised release. He ordered restitution in the full amount of $257,916.61. He ordered Kenneth to relinquish, on the spot, his funeral director's license and his insurance producer's license. He barred Kenneth, for the entire period of court supervision, from holding any position of fiduciary trust, funeral director, insurance agent, financial advisor, executor, or agent under power of attorney. Kenneth was taken into custody from the courtroom. He served the front end of his minimum at the State Correctional Institution at Phoenix in Collegeville, Montgomery County. Neild Family Funeral Care closed within 90 days of his sentencing. The brick building on King Street in Malvern was sold to a competing funeral home in 2022. The viewing rooms were renamed. The 3 charities Keith Jerome had named, the Children's Home in Honduras, the Girls' Scholarship Fund in East Africa, and the Coatesville Senior Center, never received the bequests. The restitution, when collected, would be paid into the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Restitution Fund and disbursed under court supervision. The available public record does not indicate how much of the full amount ordered has actually been recovered. What remains is a single signature on a single piece of paper, executed at a kitchen table in Bucks County in the summer of 2016 by an 84-year-old man who knew he was dying and who had taken the trouble, in the time he had left, to choose someone he believed would carry out his wishes. He chose the man who buried him. The man who buried him was also the man who stole from him. In the weeks he was dying, in the weeks after he had died, And in the months in which that same man was telling one insurance company he was dead and another insurance company he was still alive, that was the whole case. That was always the whole case. This one was hard to sit with. But the case on your screen right now is even darker. Click it.